Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is John Roberti, and today's topic is, what's the role of journalism in antitrust? A conversation with Leah Nylen. In many ways, antitrust is about the facts. It's about things that happen. And to be an effective antitrust practitioner, you have to understand what's going on around you. What is changing with the regulators? How is the law developing? Many things that are very dynamic. And for many of us, we rely on different press and publications. Some of us rely on the antitrust law section to provide updates. But for very current issues, we rely on the journalists. And there is a small but mighty group of journalists to cover antitrust and consumer protection. Today, we're going to speak with one of the leaders of that group to learn more about how it all works, how she got involved in it, and the role that journalism can play in the development of antitrust. With me today is my co-host, Anora Wang. Hi, Anora.
Hi, John.
So, Anora, what are we talking about today?
We're going to talk about antitrust journalism and also how to be one, be a journalist who is working very much in antitrust bar and around people who like us and still don't, dislike us, I hope. And then we're hoping to find out how she does her job and how this is essentially important to us and to the general public.
All right. So who's our guest today?
Our guest, Leah Nylen, who is a reporter who covers antitrust and investigations for Politico, is very much known within the antitrust bar. Before joining Politico, Leah spent 8 years covering antitrust at MLEX. Leah also worked for Bloomberg and Congressional Quarterly before. In 2014, Leah was selected as an Abe Journalist Fellow for a reporting project in Japan on price-fixing cartels and cartel deterrence policies. Leah is also active on Twitter, where many of us get the earliest updates of ongoing antitrust cases and activities. So we thank her for that and are very fortunate to have her today.
All right, let's bring her in. Leah Nylen, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Leah, we're glad that you're making time for this. I know you're probably busy always, but particularly when there are more antitrust activities going on. So thank you for making the time. Just really to get it started, let us know how did it happen? How did you end up doing what you're doing? Did you, when you were 5 years old, were you thinking that you're going to be a journalist covering antitrust?
Actually, I'm one of those stereotypical journalists that did want to be a journalist since they were a kid. I think I was actually about 8, and I saw the movie All the President's Men. And for some reason, I thought it would be really cool to hang out in parking garages and get secret documents from people. So that was like the thing that did it for me, and I wanted to be a journalist. So I went to undergrad, and then I went to journalism school at Northwestern in Chicago, very well-known journalism school. And after that, I moved back to DC because at the time, if you wanted to be a journalist, you really had to do the DC or the New York route. So I did DC, started covering Congress, realized I hated covering Congress. And so then started covering the Justice Department. I worked for a now sadly defunct website called Main Justice that covered the Justice Department in depth. And then I moved on to Bloomberg, where they had me doing government contract law. And I don't know if you know anything about government contract law, but it is extremely boring. So when
compared to antitrust, that's great news for the rest of us.
Yeah. So when I heard that there was this company based in Brussels that was opening a Washington bureau to cover antitrust, I was like, well, that has got to be more exciting than government contracts. So I applied and I became one of MLEX's very first employees in the U.S. That was back in 2011. And I sort of helped build MLEX globally. So we built the U.S. bureau. I became the chief correspondent for the U.S., and then I became the chief correspondent for global antitrust. So we helped build the China bureau, the Brazil bureau, the Seoul and the Tokyo bureaus, the Australia bureau. And wow. This was all really fun because, I would get to go around the world and meet, antitrust enforcers in all sorts of different jurisdictions and find out how they do it. And
That's great. Go ahead.
After 8 years at MLEX, I decided it was probably time to try doing something a little bit different. So I moved to POLITICO right at the start of the pandemic in January of 2020. So I have now been there, what is that? I guess 18 months, something like that. So
yeah, we're going to track your career path a little closer later, but let me start with the 8-year-old you when you watched the movie and you were interested in chasing secret papers. How much of that is happening today?
I have been really disappointed that nobody has ever wanted to meet me in a parking garage to give me secret papers, to be honest. So this is the notice to everyone listening. The way to get my attention is probably to send me an email and be like, hey, I have some secret documents. Want to go meet in a parking garage?
We actually are recording this podcast from a parking garage today. That's how we were able to get Leah on the program.
Yeah, that doesn't happen a lot in real life. But it's a lot more of the, you do see Robert Redford on the phone a lot. That still happens. You spend a lot of time on the phone and now, on email and going out. Well, it's the pandemic, so we don't actually go out and meet people anymore. But before the pandemic, you would go out for coffee or, conferences and chat with people a lot.
So how do you get people to talk to you?
Well, generally, you don't start by asking them their most privileged and confidential secrets. Although, if people want to offer this up on the first, convo, I am definitely down for that.
Yeah, meet Leah in the parking garage if you want to do that.
I generally, introduce myself to a lot of people, try to be pretty personable and show that I'm interested in this topic and interested in understanding it in depth. And generally, if you start a conversation with someone about something they like talking about and are knowledgeable about it, they'll talk to you about it. There are some people that I have now known, as I've been doing this now for about a decade. There are some people I met my very first year who I still talk to every week. And, it is a little bit about building relationships with people over time. I think probably a little bit like how lawyers build relationships with their clients over time.
Yeah. I imagine you have to get people to trust you.
Yeah, you're not always trying to publish people's most confidential secrets. Sometimes, people want the publicity, like if they win a trial, if they have recently filed a complaint. There are a lot of things that are public that people want to get out there. And so it's a little bit of a mix of, publishing the things that people do want out there and publishing the things that people maybe don't want out there.
How often does it happen when people tell you something really exciting, really publishable, and then tell you, oh, off the record?
Well, see, this is a very important point of journalism. When you are doing a conversation with someone, it's always really important to set the terms of your conversation up front. This is something they teach you in journalism school and drill into you all the time, because what you really don't want to happen is for somebody to tell you something really juicy and then say, oh, by the way, that was off the record. That's not really how it's supposed to work. So you're supposed to, at the beginning of a conversation, establish the terms of how you're talking. So generally, a lot of my conversations are either on the record, meaning we're going to, I'm free to use whatever, or we do them in what's called on background, which means I'm interviewing the person, but I'm probably not going to refer to them by name. I'm going to refer to them in some slightly shielded capacity. So a person familiar with the Google investigation. So that, they're a little bit more free to give me details or to talk about it without, worrying about, getting yelled at by their boss for telling me things. You generally don't want to use off the record, because off the record means they're telling me something that I can never use. And I never want to know things that I can never use, because then they
what's
drive
the
me
point
insane.
of that?
I know.
But there must come a point where you have to make a call sometimes about, this is probably overstating, but burning a source, right? Somebody has told you something and it's important what they've told you, but you sort of see, and maybe they don't, that if it gets published, it could come back on them. How do you make that call?
I mean, I try to never ever burn sources because you never know when you're going to need somebody again, and it's generally not worth it. What you can do in that kind of a situation is try and find somebody else who knows that information and use them because you already have some details then of what happened or whatever the thing is. If you can find somebody else to confirm that, it's a little bit easier, and then you're using that person as the source, not necessarily the person who told you. But yeah, I mean, there certainly are circumstances where it's a close call on that. I guess I can give an example of this. There was a time once when some lawyers forgot to redact their confidential complaint on Pacer, and we got a copy of it.
I'm well aware of that particular situation. Yeah.
And they really, really didn't want us to publish it because, they were going to get in a lot of trouble. And I was like, look, we got this document online on Pacer. Like, we got it in the public domain. I'm really sorry that it's going to hurt you all, but we legitimately got it this way and we have the right to publish it. So.
And you changed redacting forever. Because after that happened, everybody learned how to properly redact documents. I mean,
this is not true. I taught all of my colleagues how to double check people's redactions, and I'm so proud of them. I was so proud of them the other day when they discovered that I think it was Google didn't properly redact their response to the Texas Attorney General's complaint.
So tell us, how do you double check? Is something not properly redacted?
Trade secret.
I'd like to know from my.
But we'll talk. We'll give you a little bit of training on that after the program, Anora. Sort of, kind of a similar vein, though. Do you ever worry that the people that are talking to you have an agenda? I mean, with lawyers. With lawyers, look, if you were a lawyer advocating on behalf of your client, you should be single-mindedly thinking about how am I going to advance my client's interests. And, a lawyer who talks to a journalist who's not advancing her client's or his client's interests is probably not doing the right thing by their client if they're doing it for their own advancement. So you're always, and as advocates, I think we always are trying to position ourselves, and we're saying, well, how could I use the press to get leverage in this negotiation or to, whatever it is that I'm trying to do? How do you filter that? Yeah.
I think I tend to be a little bit of a skeptical person. There's this joke in journalism that if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So definitely, I never take anything anyone says at face value. You know that when people come to you with information, they always have an agenda for why they want that information out there. And part of your job is trying to figure out what that agenda is and then try and make it as clear as possible to the reader, like what the motivation of the person is. So, if somebody is leaking something to me about the Google or Facebook case, they're generally not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They want it in the news that this probe is still ongoing and that it's, maybe getting close to coming to something. And so you keep that in mind, definitely all the time. And it's always very important to like check it against the other side to see if it's, what their perspective is on that particular fact or, whether they think it's a fair characterization or not.
Since we're talking about agenda and also just, for the general good for the public, do you feel like you have agenda? Do you feel like you have some specific purpose or goal in your career as an antitrust journalist?
I think so. I don't think journalists are necessarily neutral. Like our job, the way we see ourselves is as making information available to the public. We're sort of an essential part of the public square. We try and make sure that people know what the government or companies or the judiciary are doing so that they're informed. Journalists very often are staunch defenders of the First Amendment and publishing information. I think also, especially when you're talking about a subject that's complicated like antitrust, it's very important because not a lot of people know about it. I mean, in the general public. And so you have a little bit of an obligation to explain what it is and why it is, I guess. Like, what is it that the government is trying to accomplish with a lawsuit against Google? What is it it's trying to accomplish by looking at this merger and things like that?
One of the things we talk about actually on our program quite a bit is the importance that a lawyer has in taking something that's really complicated and making it simple and understandable. I think your job is probably that on steroids, right? It's take it. So we take something that's really complicated and make it understandable for a really smart judge or a real, group of jurors who are focused on it and probably have some background and, can kind of understand it. But you're trying to make things understandable for regular folks. How do you do that?
I think
what are some tips?
Is there's definitely an aspect of journalism that's actually a little bit more like translation. You are talking to really, really smart people and trying to make what they are saying as understandable and digestible as possible. And I will say that coming to Politico has definitely taught me a little bit more about that. MLex is a great publication, but it's very much focused on lawyers. So you can use terms that lawyers would understand. At MLex, they do that all the time. So they're not going to explain maybe what a hypothetical monopolist test is. At Politico, I'm probably never actually even going to use the words hypothetical monopolist test.
You might use those three words, but not in that order.
Yeah, because you really do need to break it down to make it a lot more understandable. And I think that's one of the great things I've been working on at Politico is how to translate these concepts that are, at base, they're not actually that difficult. Competition and antitrust is about making sure that the marketplace works well. It's a fair marketplace. So it's just trying to come up with ways to describe how the law has evolved to ensure that in digestible chunks.
What is, in your view, what is the most important or the most impactful story that you have broken in the antitrust world?
I think a lot of people would probably say the Google one that I wrote recently. I'm going to say the story I wrote actually that I think meant the most to me was one I wrote when I was at MLex about, it was an in-depth look at Celgene and how it has used various tactics to ensure that it had maintained a longer monopoly on some of its cancer drugs. And I actually went and spoke to a bunch of cancer patients about how this impacted them personally. And there was like a woman who had to sell her house so that she could continue living. That story, I think, it was written for MLex, so it didn't have a hugely broad audience, but some other outlets like CBS ended up picking it up. And then, there have been congressional hearings and there's been a lot of talk about Celgene in Congress and in the press. And so I think that was definitely a story that was impactful to me and I think maybe impactful overall.
So, journalism has actually played a really important role in antitrust history. And I've been sort of reflecting on that recently as we've seen a review of some of the tech companies, some of the platform companies, and how we think about them. If you think back 110 years ago, the oil companies, Standard Oil, was in a similar place. And part of the story, I think, in how the Clayton Act was passed and how Standard Oil was ultimately broken up had to do with a journalist named Ida Tarbell. I don't know. I think you had mentioned to us earlier that that she is somebody who is known to journalists. What do you think? What's the role of Ida Tarbell in all of this?
Yeah, Ida Tarbell is a very well known in journalism history as one of the people who sort of almost invented the concept of investigative journalism. The way she did her reporting was different than a lot of people at the time because she didn't just go and try and interview people, although she did. She also used a lot of government documents, SEC filings, sort of documents that exist about companies in her work. And then she would also do pretty in-depth interviews with people, asking them for anecdotes. So in fact, her stories were some of the first that would sort of include anecdotes about people and about Standard Oil and the company. So she's considered sort of one of the founders of investigative journalism and was obviously very successful. So we look back on her with quite a bit of respect. So I think it is very true that we're at another moment where journalism is playing a pretty big role in how people are thinking about their relationship with companies, particularly, I think, the tech companies in particular. But I think you're seeing a lot of thought about different companies as well. I mean, you have the Amazons and the Googles of the world. There's also been, especially during the pandemic, a lot of thought about like how agriculture is very concentrated. There were meat shortages and people were having difficulty getting, dairy and eggs and things like that. And so I think people are rethinking their relationship to a lot of different types of companies right now.
The journalism piece, the Ida Tarbell is interesting, particularly to me. I mean, this is 1911-ish, right? And she's a woman who doesn't have the right to vote at that point, right? I think that's where we were in our history. Yikes. But very influential in getting the Clayton Act passed, which, led to a great deal of enforcement. I'm not sure it's exactly the same, but, Lena Khan wrote an article about Amazon in 2016. And some might say that was a catalyst that got people rethinking that. What do you see that parallel?
Yeah, I definitely think it's true. Before she went to law school, Lena Khan was actually a journalist. And she wrote a bunch of stories for primarily slightly more progressive outlets like The Prospect, The American Prospect, Washington Monthly, and things like that, that were looking at how antitrust or sort of large companies were impacting the everyday consumer. There is one that is still really well known today about chicken farming. And that is actually what got her interested in going to law school. And she went to law school, wrote that paper about Amazon that sort of blew up. And, as I've talked to people, they've said that they think that her sort of beginnings as a journalist really impact how she approaches problems. The most important aspect of being a journalist is being very curious and wanting to know a lot of information and knowing how to ask questions. And I think, to be honest, those are really important skills in any type of career. And I think you see that sometimes in how she approaches problems.
Approach definitely matters, but also formed opinions or observations. I think you have done this for long enough that you might have some insightful observations of antitrust, the profession, and also things all related. Probably even more insightful than some practitioners. What would be the most important thing that you would rank as something you learned from covering antitrust?
I think that's sort of a hard question, but I guess I joke with everyone that there's actually antitrust in everything. Antitrust actually impacts so much of your life that you're unaware of in lots of different ways. So sometimes people love to quiz me. They're like, "What about this?" And I'm like, there was a cartel on that in the 80s. And it's actually,
I just want to let you know, similar conversations usually happen during Thanksgiving in antitrust attorneys' families, and they're not universally welcomed.
I don't know where you're eating your Thanksgiving turkey, Anora, but
But not mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No. I just, there is antitrust impacts so much of what everyone does in everyone's lives. The one thing I would say is antitrust lawyers tend to, when they talk about it, get a little bit abstract and use lots of their fancy words. I guess my one piece of advice is break it down a little bit more. These concepts are not so difficult that everybody can understand them. We just tend to talk about them in a way that is very esoteric and not easily understood by the general public. It's a little bit how, I don't know if you've ever heard health professionals or two doctors talk and you have no idea what they're talking about.
Smile and nod.
Yeah.
But Leah, so, and just sort of following up on the question that Anora just asked, if you're a lawyer that would like to be quoted by a journalist,
yes,
what tips do you have?
One, I would say, introduce yourself to some journalists. As you mentioned, I think at the very beginning, there are not actually all that many of us. We are a small but mighty cadre of antitrust journalists. So introducing yourself is probably step one. Step two, let us know if there is a particular thing you can talk about, because oftentimes there are cases or things that where you're conflicted and, because your law firm has a client or whatever, you can't speak on that. But if I know that you can talk on a particular case, that's super useful to me, because then I can be like, oh, I'm writing on that. Oh, I remember that I can go to X, Y, and Z, and they can offer me a interesting opinion on it. So I obviously have lists of people who are available and I tend to go to on a particular story because I know that they are knowledgeable about that issue and that they can speak on it publicly.
And what about when you speak to a journalist? Any tips on how lawyers should speak to journalists? I
mean, I would say make sure that you have that conversation about how you want to be quoted up front. So if you want to be quoted, make sure you say, this is on the record. And then if you don't want to be quoted, make sure you say that up at the beginning too. Say, I want this only to be on background. This is only for your information. Don't quote me. And then it's possible, it doesn't have to be an either or throughout the entire conversation, but you just need to be clear, I'm going to tell you something now that I want to be on background. And then generally people will agree and you can keep talking. So just try and be as clear as possible about the terms of what you want from the conversation at the beginning.
Yeah. And as once in a while, somebody wants to quote me, which is odd. But when it does, I try to speak in very simple sentences and shorter sentences than sometimes we're used to as lawyers. Not having complex compound statements peppered throughout the discussion. And shorter, in some ways, shorter and pithier.
Yeah, almost, I think that's definitely true. Like we're looking for the way to describe it in the fewest words possible and in, as compact and understandable as possible. Oftentimes, when I'm talking to somebody, maybe if I haven't talked to them a bunch of times before, I'm going to ask them to break down something that they just said. You may have made a point and I'm like, can you explain that? Explain that to me as though I am a fifth grader. Like, can you break it down a little bit more, what you mean by that? That's definitely helpful for the general public.
All right. And if we go to a conference, say an ABA conference, is there any way we can recognize you?
Yes. Well, the ABA, of which I am a member, I want you guys to know, I'm a member of the Antitrust Bar, but they always make me wear this bright yellow name badge. And lots of people like to joke it's because I'm a yellow journalist. I am not a yellow journalist. I'm a legit journalist, guys.
Would you prefer to wear a red J? Would that help?
I don't know, maybe let's like break it up a little bit. Orange. I really like the color orange. Can we have orange badges one year?
Let me see what I can do. Let me feed that back to the people who run the conferences. And we'll see what we can do. We can try to get you some orange or maybe
bright green,
purple.
you know.
Purple is nice, neutral. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. This is great. Thank you for doing this. This is great. But let's shift gears a little bit. Leah, tell us something interesting about yourself that we wouldn't know if we only knew you professionally.
I was debating with my husband what to say for this. I really like tattoo art. And I have 7 tattoos. I use this as my get to know your new Politico, and people were shocked that I would have tattoos. But my dad was in the Navy. I grew up in a Navy family, and tattoos are pretty common on sailors. So it doesn't seem all that shocking to me. And I just think, especially today, there's so much new tattoo technology and such. They're doing very interesting art. It's not just like mermaids on people's shoulders anymore.
My issue with tattoos is they're very difficult to edit.
That's true. You have to be very sure you want it. And so I encourage people to think about it and make sure you want that on your body for at least a year before you go ahead.
Right. Think if you have to redact part of your tattoo.
I generally, think maybe words are not the way to go, but maybe mom or something, that, I do know some people who have mom tattoos.
Unless, of course, you go back and kind of check what mom is saying. If she tells you she loves you and you check that out, redacting that could get awfully challenging. I hope this is not too personal a question, but what is the tattoo that you have that we in the Antitrust Bar would be surprised to learn that you have?
I have a narwhal on my shoulder. Narwhals are very popular sea creatures among sailors. So we had one, like this huge narwhal on the mantelpiece when I was a kid until I accidentally broke the nose off of it. My dad was pretty mad.
Again, no playing ball in the house was probably an important rule. Have you considered getting an antitrust themed tattoo?
I have, and I just it's hard to come up with a good antitrust themed tattoo. So all of the tattoos on my one arm, I'm getting what's known as a sleeve. So eventually my one arm will be filled with tattoos, are all literary references to things. So I have, for various different poems on my arm, but I've been trying to think of what is a good antitrust thing. And I just don't know, it's hard to come up with a pictorial representation of antitrust.
So I'm going to make you an offer here, Leah. The listeners of our Curious Amalgam, we can ask them, and I'm sure they would be delighted to come up with a list.
I would love to come up with, yes, please ask your listeners to come up with a antitrust themed tattoo ideas for me.
Okay, again, not something I expected coming into this podcast today, but our big takeaway today we will go back and make sure that in our stitches we are asking people for ideas about antitrust themed tattoo. Okay, let's go to our final segment, the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
Okay, in my right hand, I have a series of questions. When we're together, we have a hat, and typically we would pull a question out of the hat. You would answer the question you pull out, but since we're not together today, I have a list of questions in my hand, and they're numbered from 1 to 25. So choose a number between 25, and I will read you the question that corresponds with that number.
13.
Okay. Question number 13. If you could meet anybody, living or dead, in history, who would it be?
Dude, can I only pick one?
You can pick 2.
Okay. Because I would really like to meet Ida Tarbell. I would also really like to meet Ida B. Wells, who is another journalist from that same period. And if I can pick 3, I would say I would also love to meet Nellie Bly, who is a woman journalist from that period who invented the undercover journalism entire field.
So a couple follow-up questions.
Yes.
Where would you meet them? Starbucks? What would you?
Well,
in the garage.
I feel like, I know. I don't think they had parking garages back then, though, because, I guess that was probably, right around the time that automobiles. So, and I'm not sure I would really want to meet somebody in a stable, because those would probably smell.
Yeah.
But, back in the day, ladies had tea. I would love to have tea and, finger sandwiches and talk about, undercover journalism techniques. Wouldn't that be cool?
Have you? That would be cool. Have you given thought to why there are so many historic journalists named Ida?
I thought about that. I was wondering this. I was like, that must have been like the name one year. But as I was like thinking about this, there were so many really interesting women journalists of that period. This is like the late 1800s to 1920s about period. I think maybe because like if you were a single woman and hadn't been married, you didn't have that many options, but you still might be able to do some writing. People wouldn't think that was too weird.
Well, this has been great. I think we're out of time. So until next time, we will see you on our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.